We're going to do the top 10 stories of the decade, both for Alabama and for national. Now, this is tactics. Local news always takes priority. So we're going to give you the top 10 stories for the decade in the state of Alabama first, then national. Number 10. Now, this is one that is near and dear to my heart. The kick six. So the 2013 Iron Bowl ended in one of the strangest and most exciting ways humanly possible. And I think that this is made even more special by the fact that the call on this was by the late, great Rod Bramlett. You know, this was a hard year to be an Auburn fan. And I'm not talking about because we had 4 losses. I mean, obviously that didn't make it easier. But I'm saying regardless of how well we did, this was a rough year to be an Auburn fan because we lost Pat Sullivan and Rod Bramlett in very sudden fashion, in tragic ways, in the same year. And so this is a friend of mine, somebody that I actually did get to work with and had the privilege of knowing over at Auburn Network, radio legend Rod Bramlett with his most famous call of all.
So I guess if this thing comes up short, he can field it and run it out. All right, here we go. 56-yarder. Does not have the leg. And Chris Davis takes it in the back of the end zone. He'll run it out to the 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 45. There goes Davis. Oh, my God. Davis is going to run it all the way back. Auburn's going to win the football game. Auburn's going to win the football game. He ran the missed field goal back. He ran it back 109 yards. They're not going to keep him off the field tonight. Holy cow. Oh, my God. Auburn wins. Auburn has won the Iron Bowl. Auburn has won the Iron Bowl in the most unbelievable fashion you will ever see. I cannot believe it. 34-28. And we thought a miracle in Jordan Hare was amazing. Oh, my Lord in heaven. Chris Davis just ran it 109 yards. And Auburn is going to the championship game.
Man, one of the greatest moments in all of sports history. I think that ESPN actually did a video, or they did some kind of countdown of like the most memorable college football plays of all time, and kick six, if I'm not mistaken, was first. There's a lot of college football history. The way that the Iron Bowl ended that way, and yes, the rivalry made a big deal out of it, and yes, the strange but incredible nature of the play made a big difference. But what's so cool about this is this was one of those things that it means a lot to Auburn fans, of course. And of course, and I'm not trying to rub it in, but, you know, it was a devastating loss for Alabama to lose at a game that was just that close. But ultimately, it did lead to Auburn making an appearance to play for the national championship, wound up losing to Florida State. But there were people for years and years afterward talking about this play. And the nature of it, the way that it just had so many big national implications, there were people that were not Auburn or Alabama fans at all didn't care, that were watching this and have seen it over and over again. That was a big deal for the state of Alabama. Now, number 9, the 50th anniversary of the Selma March, which happened in 2015. Now, understand, I'm not saying that it's the 9th most important thing in Alabama history, because if it were the actual first Selma March, definitely it would be higher on the list. But because it was the 50th anniversary, it's the anniversary of it. Now, 50th anniversary is still a big deal for the Selma March. And I actually remember it was the day that I interviewed for my radio job over at Cumulus Media Montgomery, because I came through the traffic while they were setting up for bringing the marchers over for the 50th anniversary march. And the historic presence of that, and I do hate, in some ways I really hate that Alabama's racial history makes it sort of the target of ire, but in certain ways, I'm certainly not glad that it happened here. But the really cool thing about it is that Alabama is the cradle of the civil rights movement. I mean, that's something to be proud of. The people of the state of Alabama, most of them black, but some of them of different colors, they are what really started the whole thing. This is the state where finally, I know part of the reason that it is the cradle of the civil rights movement is because it was really bad here, and it was. But that is something to be proud of, that even though there were an awful lot of people in the state of Alabama that had the wrong idea about that there were enough people in the state that were willing to say, no, it's not right to treat people differently because of the color of their skin. That is something to be proud of. And that's one of the reasons that it is such a big deal, that even though it's not the original event, even though it's just the 50th anniversary, that it definitely deserves a spot on the list. Number 8, and this is going to be another sports-related one. Alabama sports dominates, and that was the entire decade. People from other states will tell me all the time, you don't realize how lucky you are if you're a football fan to be in the state of Alabama. Now, Texas will have similar things to this, but that's partly because Texas is, ridiculously huge and has so many different teams. In the state of Alabama, which has a tiny population compared to a lot of other states, you think about how dominant we were. And a lot of it had to do with Nick Saban. And as an Auburn fan, I don't have a problem admitting that. Saban was a lot of it. I mean, for Pete's sake, this is the first year that we've had a playoff that Alabama was not in it. That's absurd. But that's how dominant Alabama has been in sports. But remember that we started out the decade with Auburn winning the 2010 national championship and then having another appearance 3 years later in 2013, right after the kick six. It is unreal how often in this past decade that the Iron Bowl has had real huge national implications on who becomes the national championship in college football. It's staggering to think how many times that has been something that the Iron Bowl was going to determine. So there's been a lot of domination from Alabama, but Auburn's been a major player. And here's another thing that a lot of people don't think about. I know that they're not big Division I schools, but Troy and UAB have had a pretty impressive amount of success for their size. Remember that a couple of years ago, Troy is the one that bumped off LSU. And you should remember also that Troy, there's a reason that Division I schools are afraid to play them, because they're seen as kind of an underdog, but they'll sneak up and win one on you, even against really tough opponents occasionally. And UAB, even though they had the whole turmoil of not even having a football team for a little while, came back and had an amazing amount of success in their division. So Alabama been incredibly dominant this decade when it comes to football especially, but also in other sports. I mean, you also look at Auburn going to the Final Four. First time a team from the state of Alabama has ever done that in baseball. Alabama and Auburn have had a decent amount of success going to the College World Series in college baseball. So this has been a very, very good decade for Alabama sports. All right, number 7. Jeff Sessions named the Attorney General. That happened, of course, in 2017. So our own Senator Jeff Sessions becomes the Attorney General for the United States. Now, that was a pretty big deal. Not only did it have national implications, and we had a guy, an actual Alabamian, sitting in the president's cabinet in some of the most important meetings that are going on in this country, but also because of the controversial nature, and I'm not going to get into the whole Sessions fight right now because I've explained my position on that probably no less than a dozen times on the show. But the fact that he was in the news so much that there was somebody from the state of Alabama, that just became a massive news story. There were people on the left and the right that liked him and didn't like him. So it just depended on what day of the week it was, it seemed like, as to how people felt about Jeff Sessions. But Jeff Sessions being Alabama's long-term senator that became the top law enforcement official, with the exception of the president, in our country, that was a really big deal for the state of Alabama. Number 6, and this one you have to go way back on, early in the decade, April 2011. The tornadoes hit Tuscaloosa, Birmingham. Some of the details on this are just staggering. It was an EF4 vortex tornado that at one point reached 1.5 miles wide. Think about that. 1.5 miles wide. That is a massive tornado. And it had winds that were measured up to, or estimated to be, 190 miles per hour. This thing, in a very short amount of time, went the span of Tuscaloosa to Birmingham. It actually tore up parts of Birmingham, a large part of the city of Tuscaloosa. $2.4 billion. That is the most damage that any tornado or tornado system has ever caused in the history of the country. Is just a massive toll. And what's far more staggering was the toll in lives. 64 people lost their lives in those horrible storms back in 2011. And that is something that the country and the world really mourned for what had happened in the state of Alabama. And that was something that was a running story for several months that put Alabama in the national and even international news, unfortunately. Number 5, the Mike Hubbard scandal of 2016. Remember that he was found guilty on 12 out of his 23 felony charges. And somehow the guy still has not found his way into prison yet. So far, there's still appeals going on. The thing about Mike Hubbard that is so tragic, the guy, and I actually knew him personally. I wasn't like close to him or anything, but I did work for him over at Auburn Network. It's something that he really should have just had the good sense to stay away, but that's the thing about politics, and this is why it's so terrifying. This game has a way of sucking you in and making you believe, oh, it's not going to happen to you. You don't have to worry about this. It really does make people think that they're above the law. And that was the folly of Speaker Mike Hubbard, who, by the way, let's remember that in the state of Alabama, the way that our Constitution is structured, in a lot of ways, Speaker of the House is the most powerful person in the state government. This is a guy that rose to the height of power in the state and lost it because he could not say no to his own greed. He could not say no to that extra money that he was going to be making on the side and profiting off of his position in the state House of Representatives. That's something Mike Hubbard just could not do. And that's one of the reasons it was so intriguing and also so tragic. I mean, I hated to see that happen to Speaker Hubbard. But the guy just would not stop. He heard that siren call and he answered it. And I think this is incredibly timely. I was sitting with some friends of I was sitting with some friends this morning at the funeral, at Montiel's funeral, and one of the good friends of the judge, AJ, brother AJ, he may be watching right now. I don't know. He watches the show occasionally. He said, you know what? He tried to tell Mike Hubbard, don't do it. Don't mess with it. Stay away from it. Distance yourself from it. And he's right. I remember. I was there. I wasn't there for that face-to-face conversation, but I was there with him on the radio when he said that, and people could see it coming, and he just would not stop. The draw of the money was just too much for him. And he's going to have to face the consequences of that. Number 4, the Republican takeover. That happened at the very beginning of this decade in 2010. Democrats had held power in the state of Alabama for 139 years. The fact that the Republicans not only took over, but had the trifecta. In other words, they had the House, the Senate, and the governorship. And by the way, in the state of Alabama, keep in mind that we also elect our judges. So they also had the Supreme Court. The fact that Alabama went from a Democrat stronghold that they had controlled the government for 139 years shows one of two things. I'll say it actually does show two things, because these things are both true. When it comes to a party, even if you have an absolute stranglehold like the Democrats had on the state government here, when you start ignoring your constituents, no matter how red or blue a state you happen to be in, it can change. And the second part of that plays off of the first point is why the Electoral College, people often decry this, well, basically 2 or 3 states decide the presidency. Yes, but those 2 or 3 states and which ones they are change constantly. That's the thing that people forget. One of the things that's so important to understand about politics is any party or candidate that ignores large enough groups of people for long enough are going to face the electoral consequences of that. The Democrats did so in the state of Alabama, and you see that at the national stage with certain states that people thought for sure were solid blue, like Wisconsin, going for Trump in this last election. That's why it's such a big story, because it reminds all of us that it doesn't matter how big or powerful or how safe you feel that you are, you can always lose power if you forget the people who gave you that power. Number 3, Doug Jones' election in 2017. Now, I don't think I have to explain why this one was such a big deal. I mean, with Doug Jones, a incredibly left-leaning Democrat, getting elected in a ruby red state, arguably the reddest state in the country, that could have only happened because there was a perfect storm of everything going on around him, and we'll get to one of those stories in a second. But with Luther Strange getting in the race, and then you had Mitch McConnell trying to back Luther Strange, and doing so trying to destroy and try to play with the chess pieces and trying to take down Mo Brooks so that he could win against Roy Moore, there were just so many moving parts of that story, and it seems as though every single little thing had to go exactly right to get a Democrat elected in the reddest state in the country. But hey, it happened. And that's one of the reasons that politics, though it's frustrating and can make you bleed through the eyes sometimes, it is fascinating to observe. Number 2, abortion is outlawed. This happens in 2019. I think we don't fully appreciate how far we've come. And maybe that's because it feels like we haven't come that far because abortion is still allowed, but I was seeing a statistic from Life News today that 79% of all of the abortion clinics that were open in 1991 have closed down now. We've seen a massive reduction in the availability of abortion because we have continued to fight this fight. And Alabama's on the front lines of it, and I could not be more proud of them. Alabama became the source of a lot of national news coverage in 2019, and the reason that I have it so high is not because of the level of coverage that we got or the people that were talking about Alabama, even though that was true when Alabama became the state that restricted abortion outright. According to the laws on the books in the state of Alabama right now, abortion is illegal. Of course, it's still going on because we'll have to see where it goes with the Supreme Court. But the fact is, on the books, our Constitution says that the unborn child is a life, and it says that abortion is outlawed because it is a violation of human rights. I think that history is going to look back and say, hey, the people of Alabama got it right. There was this barbaric practice of abortion where people were killing their own children, and the state of Alabama led the charge and said, no, we will stand up for those rights. We will stand up for the rights of those who cannot speak for themselves. And the fact that Alabama was the cradle of the civil rights movement that we talked about just a few minutes ago, I think the fact that we're leading the charge when it comes to protecting the unborn, that's going to be the next chapter in Alabama's history. And then finally, number 1, Robert Bentley scandal in 2017. Now, a lot of people would argue that it's not the most important story, but the reason that I say it is so incredibly important is because it had such a ripple effect. In a vacuum, I would agree. It's a big story. I think it's one of the top 10 of the decade. Doesn't deserve the number 1 spot. Here's why it does, though. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. The Robert Bentley scandal had ripple effects that changed the scope of everything in the state of Alabama. Because you'll remember that part of what people allege, and I say allege because technically we can't prove it, but I still believe that it's the case. The reason that Luther Strange got the senatorship, he was the attorney general that was overseeing the investigation into Robert Bentley's corruption and his affair with Rebecca Caldwell Mason. All of a sudden, he gets offered that open Senate seat from Jeff Sessions from Governor Bentley. And that reeks of corruption. It seems as though Governor Bentley was just trying to get Luther Strange out of his hair to keep him from investigating him by giving him a payoff and making him a U.S. Senator. So that happens. And whether it's true or not, the people of Alabama remembered it when the new governor, Kay Ivey, decided to go ahead and have a special election. And so you have Luther Strange becoming a senator. You have Doug Jones eventually winning that spot and becoming a senator. There are just so many ripple effects and ramifications. Aaliyah was completely turned upside down. They had to scramble for new leadership. Governor Ivey had to clean house with a lot of the Bentley appointees when it came to her taking over. And then, of course, Kay Ivey wound up becoming our elected governor, which, let's be honest, probably wouldn't have happened had she not been governor beforehand, just kind of by default. I'm not saying for sure it wouldn't have happened, but we'll never know. And so that's the reason I think this is the most important story in the state of Alabama. Now, I know you're here because you're interested in information on what's going on in the state of Alabama and around the world, and you've come to the right place for that. But it's YouTube, so you could also just be here because you're bored. If you want me to keep making videos to keep you occupied, you need to go ahead and like and subscribe. Otherwise, you're going to have to go back to playing Minesweeper.